Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story: The Forgotten Umbrella. Part 1. The Lost Item. It was a typical rainy afternoon in the city, the kind with a street shimmer with the reflection of neon lights and wet asphalt. Sarah had just finished a long day at work, tired but relieved to finally be heading home. The steady rhythm of the train, the gentle hum of the wheels on the tracks, had lulled her into a quiet daze. She had become accustomed to these daily commutes, the familiar faces, the repetitive routine, but today was different. As the train neared her stop, Sarah gathered her things, her bag, her phone, her lunchbox that she'd forgotten to finish earlier. As she stood up, she noticed the rain was coming down harder than before. She reached for her umbrella, but in the rush of moving to the door, she had forgotten it behind on the seat. The train doors slid open with a soft hiss, and she stepped off the train, unaware of the item she had left behind. The wind hit her as soon as she stepped outside, the rain pelting against her skin, cold and sharp. With a sigh, Sarah pulled her coat tighter around herself and began walking. She didn't mind the rain much. After all, she was used to it. But as she walked down the sidewalk, a strange feeling began to settle over her. She could sense the weight of something, like eyes watching her. Though when she glanced around, she saw nothing but the blur of commuters rushing to escape the storm. As Sarah turned the corner, she glanced over her shoulder, the feeling of unease growing stronger. There was something odd about the way the rain seemed to intensify around her, as though it were falling heavier in the exact spot where she stood. A strange chill swept through her, and she quickened her pace. She could hear the soft whoosh of umbrellas being opened and closed, but hers was still missing. She walked past a few shops, her mind focused on the distance between her and her warm, dry apartment. And then, just as she passed an alleyway, she turned her head to catch a glimpse of the crowd, and that's when she saw it. A figure, moving slowly behind her, holding an umbrella identical to the one she had left on the train. It was black, with a silver handle that gleamed faintly under the dim streetlights. Sarah froze for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure's face was obscured by the umbrella, but there was something unsettling about the way they moved. Fluid, almost too perfect, like they were in tune with the rain itself. A shiver crawled up her spine, and she quickened her pace again. But as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was doing the same. Each time she took a step, the sound of footsteps behind her seemed to match her movements exactly. She glanced back once more, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was still there, closer now. But when she looked ahead, she could see no one else on the street. She stopped for a moment, the city lights reflecting off the slick pavement. The rain fell in torrents now, drenching everything in sight. She pulled her coat tighter around her, trying to ignore the growing anxiety gnawing at her. I must be imagining things, Sarah muttered to herself. It's just the rain getting to me. But even as she spoke, She could feel the presence of someone behind her, following her, their footsteps echoing in the damp air. She turned around again, only to find the figure had disappeared. Her breath was shallow as she scanned the street. The rain fell harder now, a steady drumming against the sidewalk. There was no sign of anyone, no umbrella, no footsteps, just the heavy, oppressive silence. "Okay, this is ridiculous," Sarah muttered to herself. She turned back around and continued walking, but the strange sensation of being followed wouldn't leave her. Each time she glanced over her shoulder, she half expected to see that same figure, standing just a few steps behind her, as if they were waiting for her to notice. And then, when she reached the next block, she heard it, a faint but unmistakable sound, the soft whoosh of an umbrella opening. The sound was quiet at first, like a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It seemed to come from directly behind her, close enough that she could feel the weight of it in the air. Her pulse quickened, and she forced herself to keep walking, her feet moving faster now. The figure was behind her again, just at the edge of her vision. She could feel their presence like a shadow, always there. But when she tried to turn around, there was nothing. The rain had become a steady downpour, soaking her through, and her anxiety was beginning to mount. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was right there, moving in time with her. But when she looked, there was only emptiness. She walked faster, her mind racing. "It's just a coincidence," she told herself. "I'm just tired. I need to get home." But deep down, she knew something was wrong, something she couldn't explain. The streetlights flickered as she passed beneath them, casting long, stretching shadows across the sidewalk. And just when she thought she could escape it, just when she thought she had outpaced whatever was following her, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. But this time, they were louder, closer. The umbrella had returned, and now it was only a few steps away. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her steps faltered. She couldn't breathe. Part 2. The Unseen Pursuer. Sarah's heart raced in her chest as she tried to control her breathing. The footsteps behind her were growing louder, each step as deliberate and close as the last. The faint whoosh of the umbrella moving in sync with her, the sound that had become so familiar, now seemed to pulse in time with her own frantic heartbeat. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was following her. She stopped walking for a brief moment, trying to listen, to discern whether she was truly hearing things or if there was something or someone there. The rain pounded down around her, filling the space with a dull roar. But beneath it, the footsteps persisted. Soft, steady, almost patient. Sarah swallowed hard and turned to face the street behind her, her eyes scanning the empty stretch of pavement. The street lights flickered above, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the wetness of the night. There was no one there, no umbrella, no figure, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had heard the umbrella open again, had felt its presence so close to her, and yet there was no trace of the person who had been so near. Had they vanished into the rain? Or was this all some twisted figment of her imagination? The unsettling silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for her phone, her fingers slick with the rain as she tried to unlock it. The screen was smeared with droplets, making it hard to see clearly, but she finally managed to bring up her map and check her location. She was only a few blocks away from her apartment now, just a little further. Maybe she was just tired, the stress of the day clouding her thoughts. But the moment she glanced back up from her phone, her breath caught in her throat. There, at the far end of the street, was a figure, a person standing still in the rain, holding an umbrella. The umbrella gleamed, dark against the heavy downpour, and the figure was too still, too silent, as if it had been waiting there for her. Sarah's stomach twisted, and a chill spread through her limbs. The figure wasn't moving. Not yet, anyway, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her, even though she couldn't see its face. It was like they were waiting for something, waiting for her to come closer. Her feet were frozen to the ground, rooted by a mixture of fear and confusion. Why hadn't they moved? Why was this person just standing there, not even reacting to the rain that fell in torrents, soaking them completely? She wanted to turn and run, to escape, but some strange force kept her standing there. Her mind raced, trying to reason with the situation. She was being paranoid. The umbrella was just a coincidence, right? A person was waiting for the rain to let up, nothing more. But deep down, Sarah knew that was not true. The rain began to fall harder, the droplets pounding against the pavement like an endless drumbeat. As the figure remained still, Sarah took a slow, hesitant step forward, almost as if she were being drawn to it by some unseen force. Every step she took was accompanied by the feeling that she was walking further into a trap. When she took another step, something in the air shifted. She could feel the temperature drop, the chill creeping up her spine. The shadow of the figure seemed to grow larger, like it was stretching toward her. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky despite her best efforts to sound calm. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move or acknowledge her presence at all. It was as though they were nothing more than a part of the darkened street, a piece of the storm itself. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to turn away. The feeling of being watched intensified, and as she reached the middle of the street, the figure finally moved. Slowly, deliberately. The sound of their footsteps was soft against the rain, but it was unmistakable. The figure was coming toward her. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was as if the moment the figure began to walk toward her, the storm itself had responded. The rain, which had been pouring in sheets only moments before, now seemed to come down even harder, as though the heavens themselves were pressing down on her. The world around her darkened, and the figure's face remained hidden behind the dark umbrella. Instinctively, she took a few steps back, her pulse quickening. But she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. It was like she was in a trance, her feet glued to the pavement as she watched the figure move closer and closer. With each step the figure took, Sarah began to feel more and more exposed. It was as though the rain, which had once seemed like an ordinary storm, had transformed into something far more menacing. The world around her seemed to close in, the rain becoming a wall of sound, blurring her vision and drowning out everything else. The figure stopped a few paces from her, their umbrella held steady. The world seemed to hold its breath, the silence between them heavy and pregnant with tension. And then, with a sudden movement, the figure lowered their umbrella, revealing nothing but empty air. Sarah's breath hitched. The figure was gone, without a trace. Her body tensed in confusion and panic. Where had they gone? How could someone just vanish like that? Her eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The street was empty. No figure, no umbrella, just the relentless rain. She turned on her heels, heart hammering, and began to walk away faster than before, her mind racing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, her mind playing games on her. But the eerie feeling that clung to her like a wet blanket wouldn't let go. The footsteps, the umbrella, the cold chill that lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. She quickened her pace, but the rain kept falling heavier around her, as if it were following her, keeping her trapped in its cold grip. Part 3. The final step. The rain seemed endless, its steady rhythm pulsing against Sarah's skull like a drumbeat that refused to stop. She could feel the weight of the water in the air, heavy and cold, as if the storm itself had become a presence, something tangible and ominous that clung to her with each step. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts, and she kept looking over her shoulder, hoping, no, praying that the figure with the umbrella would be gone. But the further Sarah walked, the more the feeling of being pursued seemed to cling to her, like an invisible thread tugging her back, pulling her towards something unknown, something she didn't understand. The footsteps had stopped, but the sense of being followed hadn't. Her pulse raced as she scanned the street, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next, searching for the figure that had haunted her steps. She was close to home now. Only a few more blocks, and she would be safe. Safe from the storm. Safe from the strange presence that had been tracking her all this time. But with each step, the rain seemed to grow heavier, and the world around her became more distorted, as if the storm was swallowing everything in its path, including her. The street lights above flickered in the downpour, casting eerie glows on the wet pavement. She quickened her pace, her feet slapping against the sidewalk. But no matter how fast she walked, the rain felt like it was falling harder, always heavier wherever she went. And then, as she rounded the final corner toward her apartment building, she froze. There, at the entrance to her building, stood the figure once again. The same umbrella, the same dark, silent presence. It was like they had been waiting for her, as though they knew she would end up here, in this exact spot. Her heart pounded against her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stopped dead in her tracks, her body refusing to move. The figure didn't advance. It just stood there, beneath the dim light of the street lamp, waiting. There was no escape now. She could feel it. The pull was irresistible, drawing her toward the figure, making it impossible to turn away. She wanted to run, to find safety in the comfort of her apartment, but the storm and the figure seemed to have taken hold of her mind, as if the very rain itself was preventing her from breaking free. With a reluctant step forward, Sarah approached the figure. The umbrella remained motionless in their hands, the black fabric drenched, the silver handle glinting in the dark. "Who are you?" Sarah's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the downpour. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words seemed to get lost in the heavy silence. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they slowly raised the umbrella, their movements fluid, almost deliberate, and for the first time, Sarah saw their face. But it wasn't what she expected. There was no face, no eyes, no mouth, just a featureless mask of pale, smooth skin, stretching over an empty void. The sight sent a jolt of panic through her, and she stumbled backward, her hand reaching for her phone, but the screen was wet, unresponsive. It was as though the figure was beyond anything she could comprehend, beyond anything that could be explained by logic or reason. The rain continued to pour, unrelenting, and the figure seemed to be growing taller, looming over her, as if the storm itself was feeding it. The sound of the umbrella opening again rang in her ears, louder than before, echoing in the stillness of the night. But the figure didn't speak. They just stood there, waiting. Sarah backed away, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. How had they gotten here so quickly? Why hadn't she noticed them sooner? The rain felt like a prison, keeping her trapped in this endless loop of uncertainty. The streets seemed to stretch forever, and the world around her became a blur of wet shadows and distorted shapes. "Go away," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. But the figure didn't move. It was as though it was waiting for her to make the next move, to step closer to the darkness that surrounded them. Without thinking, Sarah turned and ran toward the entrance of her building. She fumbled for her keys, her hands slick with rain, her fingers slipping over the cold metal. Her heart raced in her chest as she fumbled with the lock, desperate to escape the presence that had been following her all night. Finally, the door opened, and she stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. The warmth of the lobby enveloped her, but it did little to quell the fear that still gripped her heart. She stood there, panting, her clothes soaked through, and tried to calm herself, telling herself that it was over, that she was safe now. The figure, whatever it had been, couldn't follow her inside. She had escaped, but as she looked back at the door, she froze. There, just beneath the door frame, were muddy footprints, fresh, wet, and they were leading into the lobby. Her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps didn't stop at the door. They kept coming. The umbrella had followed her inside. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story: The Rain on the Radio. Part 1. the mysterious broadcast. It had been an uneventful day for a group of 5 friends: Emma, Ben, Sarah, Tom, and Lucy, who had decided to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life for a weekend camping trip in the woods. The sky had been overcast when they arrived, but they had settled into their spot by a small creek, hopeful that the rain would hold off. However, as the evening wore on, dark clouds began to roll in, casting a shadow over their campsite. The temperature dropped, and the first raindrops fell, soft at first, then quickly escalating into a torrential downpour. They gathered around the fire, pulling on jackets and hoodies to keep warm. The sound of the rain was deafening as it pounded the roof of their small tent and splashed against the leaves in the trees above them. As the rain fell harder, it became clear that this wasn't just a passing shower. This was going to be a storm that lasted through the night. "We should probably make sure we're ready for a long night," Emma said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. "I'll get the lanterns." Ben, always the practical one, rummaged through their camping gear for the battery-powered radio that they had packed as a backup entertainment device. "Let's see if we can get a weather update," he suggested, flicking the dial on the old radio. The static buzzed in their ears as the signal bounced around. There was nothing but a series of hisses and muffled voices. They adjusted the tuning a few more times, trying to find something clear. Just as they were about to give up, the radio crackled, and a soft, clear voice emerged from the static. At first, it was difficult to make out the words, but the group fell silent, straining to hear. "Beware the shadow in the storm." The voice was faint, but chilling in its delivery. It sounded like a woman's voice, low and slow, as if each word was carefully chosen. The friends exchanged confused glances, unsure if they had heard it correctly. The voice continued, almost as if it was coming from far away, though it carried with an eerie clarity that made it impossible to ignore. "The shadow will find you in the rain. It waits, always waits." "Is this some kind of prank?" Tom asked, his eyebrows furrowing. "That's not a normal radio station." "I don't know," Ben replied, adjusting the dial again, trying to find a clearer signal. But the voice kept cutting through, the static intensifying as the woman spoke. "The storm is its cover. It will watch. It will come." The transmission suddenly cut out, leaving behind only the buzz of static. Sarah let out a nervous laugh, trying to mask her unease. "Well, that was weird. That was more than weird," Emma said, her voice tight. "I don't like the sound of that." Ben continued to twist the dial, trying to get the station back, but no luck. The only sound coming from the radio now was a constant hiss of white noise. The rest of the group fell silent, the weight of the woman's words lingering in the air. The storm outside had only grown louder, the rain beating against the tent, the wind howling through the trees. Just as they were about to put the radio down, a sudden flicker of light illuminated the woods just outside their campsite. It wasn't a flash of distant lightning. This was close, far too close. The light seemed to pulse, bright and sharp, casting strange shadows on the ground around them. For a split second, they all froze, watching in stunned silence. "Did anyone see that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before anyone could respond, another flash of lightning split the sky, lighting up the trees with such intensity that it left them all momentarily blinded. When the light faded, they turned toward the woods beyond their camp, their hearts racing, but nothing was there. Ben's hand trembled slightly as he held the radio. The static had stopped, but the ominous feeling that had settled over the group remained. The wind picked up, howling through the trees as the rain continued to pour relentlessly. The fire crackled, but it couldn't keep away the growing unease. Then, just as they were about to settle back down, a third flash of lightning lit up the woods. This time, they all saw it, a dark, shadowy figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it seemed to be watching them. Tom blinked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, barely daring to speak above the sound of the storm. The figure remained motionless, its form barely visible in the rain, but they could all feel its presence. It was as if it wasn't just standing there, but watching them, waiting for something. Every instinct screamed for them to run, to pack up and leave, but they couldn't tear their eyes away from the shadow and the storm. It was only when the next flash of lightning illuminated the figure again that they noticed something even more unsettling. The shadow seemed to be moving, not walking or shifting, but drawing closer inch by inch. "Is it coming towards us?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. They all watched in frozen terror as the shadow seemed to step forward, slowly, deliberately. The wind picked up again, howling like a chorus of whispers around them, but the figure didn't seem to be affected by the storm. It stood tall, unmoving, but closer now, as if it had been slowly creeping toward them since the very first moment they saw it. And that was when they heard it, the faintest whisper from the radio, cutting through the static once again. The shadow in the storm. It waits, it comes for you. Suddenly, all at once, the group turned and ran. The last thing they heard as they scrambled to gather their things, their breath shallow and frantic, was the sound of the radio crackling once more. The shadow. "It will find you." They didn't stop running, not until they were far away from the campfire and the woods, not until they could no longer see the figure standing there in the storm, and even then, they didn't feel safe. They couldn't escape the shadow that had found them, lurking somewhere in the dark woods beyond. Part 2. The Whisper in the Wind. The rain fell harder than ever as the group of friends scrambled through the forest, their feet slipping on the muddy ground beneath them. They didn't stop to look behind, not even once. The fear gripping their hearts was so raw, so immediate, that it was all they could do to put one foot in front of the other. Ben led the way, his flashlight flickering as they stumbled through the trees. "We need to get to the car. We'll be safe there," he called out, his voice ragged and filled with panic. But the path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the storm obscuring everything beyond their immediate view. The trees seemed to close in on them, their gnarled branches reaching out like dark, twisted hands. "There's no way we're going back to that camp," Emma panted, her breath coming in quick bursts. The figure, it wasn't normal. I don't know what it was, but it felt wrong. Sarah's eyes darted nervously over her shoulder, as though she half expected to see the shadowy figure emerging from the storm behind them. "What do you think it wanted?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Ben replied, his grip tightening on his flashlight as he pushed forward. "But it was too real to be some kind of hallucination. We need to get to the car. We're safer there." Tom, who had fallen behind, called out, his voice tight with fear. "Wait!" Did anyone hear that? The group paused, straining to listen. The sound of the storm had grown even more intense, the rain beating down in sheets against the leaves. But amidst the chaos, there was something else. A faint, rhythmic tapping like footsteps in the mud, slow and deliberate. "I don't hear anything," Emma said, her voice tinged with confusion and fear. "There's no one here. No, I swear." "Listen," Tom insisted. His eyes were wide as he glanced nervously around. It's behind us." The group turned, their heads swiveling, trying to pierce through the darkness of the rain. The only thing they could see was the blackness of the storm, the thick, unrelenting downpour, and the trees that loomed around them like shadows in the night. "I don't see anything," Lucy said, clutching her jacket tightly around her. But her voice trembled as she spoke. The tapping noise grew louder, closer now, echoing off the trees. It wasn't a figment of their imagination. It was real. The sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her hand clutching her chest. "What if it's still following us?" Ben took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "It's just the rain playing tricks on us. We're freaking out. We need to focus, okay?" We keep going. We get to the car, and we leave. But before they could take another step, they heard it. The unmistakable sound of a voice, faint but distinct, coming from behind them. Come back to the storm." The voice was soft and haunting, a whisper carried on the wind. It sounded distant, but somehow right behind them. And then another sound joined in. Footsteps, slow but purposeful, crunching through the wet leaves. It was like a terrible dance, a rhythm that kept pace with their hurried steps. As they turned and ran again, they noticed it. There was a figure, not far off, standing still just beyond the trees. It was the same tall shadow they had seen at their campsite. "Not again!" Tom screamed, panic flooding his voice. The figure didn't move, not at first. It stood motionless, as if waiting for them to draw closer. But they didn't dare approach. The rain was coming down in torrents, so thick now that it felt like a curtain was drawn between them and the rest of the world. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the trees, like a wisp of smoke lost in the storm. They froze, breath caught in their throats. Had it disappeared? Or had it come closer? Did it move? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. I don't know, Ben replied, his heart hammering in his chest. But we can't stay here. We need to keep moving. They pushed forward, stumbling through the muddy forest, the rain blurring their vision. Each step felt like it took them further from safety, deeper into the woods. And yet, the storm seemed to press in on them from all sides, as if it were closing in, trapping them in its embrace. The footsteps, if they were even real, had stopped, but the whispers continued, growing louder. The wind howled around them, carrying voices with it, voices that echoed and faded, like something calling to them from a far-off place. Come back. Come closer. Don't run. Stop. Just stop it, Tom cried, turning to face the trees, as if he could shout the voices away. But there was no answer, no sign of anything except the storm. As they moved on, they could feel the weight of the air pressing down on them, the storm growing colder, more oppressive. The wind carried the promise of something far darker than just a regular storm. It was as though the very storm itself was alive, waiting for them to make a mistake. The flashing lightning only made the woods seem even more sinister, illuminating the twisted trunks and branches in a stark, unnatural light. Each flash was like a reminder that something was out there, something watching, waiting for them to slip up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, the trees began to thin, and they could make out a distant light. It was the campsite they had abandoned. The car was parked just up ahead, a beacon of safety, but they still couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was following them. They reached the car, breathless and trembling, and Ben hurriedly fumbled with the keys. The rain continued to pour, relentless and heavy, but the car's headlights cut through the storm, revealing the empty woods around them. They piled in quickly, locking the doors, but the atmosphere inside the car was far from comforting. The whispers hadn't stopped, and as they sat there in silence, they realized something even more terrifying. The storm hadn't let up. The rain continued, louder now, as if it was pounding against them, pushing in from all sides. It was the voice again, faint but unmistakable. Come back, come to the storm. The storm was far from over. Part 3, The Shadow and the Storm. The car felt like a prison now, the heavy rain battering the windows as though the storm itself wanted in. The windshield wipers moved in frantic motion, but it did little to clear the ever-thickening water on the glass. The shadows around them seemed to dance with each lightning strike, growing longer, reaching toward them like fingers. Ben sat behind the wheel, his hands tied around the steering wheel, knuckles white. The rest of the group sat in tense silence, their eyes darting nervously between the dark forest and the car's interior. No one spoke. No one needed to. They all knew that something was wrong. They could all feel it in the air, thick and heavy, as though the storm had become a living thing, a malevolent force that watched them from the trees. Why hasn't the storm stopped? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. It's been hours. Ben shook his head. I don't know. We just need to stay calm. The rain has to stop eventually, right? But the storm was relentless. The rain hammered against the roof of the car like 1,000 tiny fists, and the howling wind seemed to pull at the trees, making the woods creak and groan. The sound of the rain was so deafening that it drowned out everything else, except for one thing: the voice. It came again, faint but unmistakable. "Come back. Come closer. The storm calls." Emma shivered, hugging her knees to her chest. "That's not just the wind. It's real. It's been real since the moment we heard it on the radio," Tom interjected, his voice sharp. "That voice." Before he could finish, the car lurched. The tires squealed as though they had hit something, and Ben slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping into his throat. "What was that?" Lucy cried out, her eyes wide with fear. Ben's fingers trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. He peered into the storm, trying to make sense of what had happened. I don't know. Something in the road. I think we hit something." But when he looked again, there was nothing. No obstacle, no debris in the road. Just the thick, endless rain and the dark trees on either side, stretching like an endless maze. The group went silent again, all of them trying to process what had just happened. It was as if they had just encountered some invisible force, something beyond the physical realm. Then, suddenly, the radio crackled to life again. It wasn't the usual static between stations. It was a voice. "Do not listen," the woman's voice warned, her words strained and urgent. "Do not let the shadow in." The static that followed was sharp and unsettling, like nails on a chalkboard. The group stared at the radio, unable to tear their eyes away, the tension in the car thickening. "What does she mean?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. "What shadow? What's going to happen?" "We should have never come here," Tom whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave. We need to get away from this place." Ben didn't respond. He couldn't. The words felt stuck in his throat, as if something unseen, was choking him. It was then that the others noticed it too. A shape. It wasn't visible through the rain, not at first. But as the lightning flashed again, a dark figure appeared, standing just outside the headlights of the car. It was tall, like the shadow they had seen before, and it was closer now, its form barely outlined in the rain-soaked night. "No," Sarah gasped, pressing herself back into her seat. "It's here. It's real." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, still as the storm raged around it, as though waiting for them to make the next move. Ben's hands were shaking. He knew what they had to do. He had to get the car started and drive away, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the storm was holding him in place, as though the figure outside was locking them in place with its presence. Another lightning strike, and this time the figure moved. It took a slow step forward, then another. Its movement was unnatural, like it was floating rather than walking. "Start the car, Ben," Tom shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Start it now." Ben's foot slammed down on the gas, and the car jolted forward, tires spinning in the mud as they accelerated. but the figure didn't move from their path. It seemed to follow them, keeping pace with the car despite the rain and the wind. Ben swerved the wheel, trying to avoid the dark shape, but it wasn't just standing outside. It was everywhere, in the periphery of the headlights, in the rain-soaked woods. The shadow seemed to stretch across the forest, an ever-present force. The car hit a large puddle, sending water spraying up on all sides, but the figure kept pace, as though it was moving through the very storm itself. No matter how fast they drove, no matter how hard they tried to escape, the shadow was there, closing in on them. Then, as quickly as it had started, the storm seemed to let up. The rain lightened, the thunder faded into the distance, and the figure, whatever it was, disappeared into the night. The woods were silent again. Ben slammed the brakes and turned the car off, his chest heaving with relief, but it didn't feel like safety. Not yet. The radio crackled once more, the woman's voice barely audible. Don't forget, the storm never leaves. The shadow follows, and with that, the static filled the air, a reminder that the storm and the shadow were still out there, waiting, watching. They had only just begun to understand the true meaning of the warning. Would they ever escape? Only the storm knew. This concludes the story of the rain on the radio. I hope it brought you the relaxation and calm you were looking for, with just the right touch of suspense.